Just a few words about Natalie. I met her actually fairly recently, this year, and I don't know how, but I really didn't know about her research until we had a conversation, and then I started delving into her research. And so I want to tell you a few things about it. The parts that are really unusual. So she has publications in the neurosciences, non-human animal cognition. That's the new Caledonian crows, which are an incredible, really an incredible group of birds. They're part of the COVIDs, and they are spread around the world, the globe, pretty much as human beings are. They're really unusually adaptive. She's worked in cultural anthropology, small-scale societies, sometimes hunters and gatherers, human development, which is mostly child development, among what is called, for those of you who don't know, children in, and not only in, what are called weird countries. Weird is Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. Now, most people will feel lucky if they can master the literatures and the theories in one field. And Natalie has mastered the literature, the theories, the methodologies, research literatures in all of these fields. So that is really an unusual feat. I don't know many people who have done that, who have managed to do that. I know very few people who have. And she has a wonderful habit of asking unerringly good questions, questions that can be answered by research or research literature if you go to the library, and empirical research. And as all of you PhD students have heard now, probably many times, it's never too many times, the question you ask is going to be one of the most critical parts of the work that you do. Not great question and wonderful, impeccable research will lead to something which is not going to be particularly interesting. So it's really important to know what the big questions are that you're asking and how you plan to go about answering the questions that you're asking. So Natalie, thank you for getting up early and spending time with us and enlightening us about the research that you're doing. It's about the prehistory of teaching. Just one quick word. In prehistory, what do we know about prehistory? We see stones, we have artifacts, we have stones, or we have anatomy, we have teeth and bones, and not too much more really. But how can you know what teaching was like in prehistory? The moment you teach, it evaporates. So how can you know? Well, you can't know the way you know when you look at stones in the Stone Age or copper or the various ages. You don't have artifacts that give you direct information about it. So you have to have inferences from what you have, from data that you have, that will allow you to make claims about something which you really don't see. You see the products of, which is teaching. So, Natalie, thank you very much again. Looking forward to hearing yet another wonderful lecture of yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this introduction. It's a real pleasure, a real honor to be here and to speak to you all. Very nice to see so many of you. So I as Professor Strauss said, I have a lot of interest in different disciplines. I actually started studying cognitive science, and I also have a degree, 2 degrees in linguistics along the way. And then I shifted over to anthropology and archaeology for my PhD. And then after my PhD, I moved more into biology and neuroscience. So I actually sit right in between all of these disciplines, and I'm always thinking of new ways to bring them together. So I will talk about a little bit of all of these things today. And I try to use terms that are understandable to everybody. So if there's anything that you don't understand, feel free to interrupt and ask for clarification. So the outline of my talk: first, I will introduce the general research questions, and then I'll present an experiment about teaching how to make stone tools. I'll present this experiment on origami, which is the paper that I sent to circulate. And then I'll conclude with some of my thoughts about unschooling and what education means in unschooled people. So first of all, what is the definition of teaching? Well, there are real debates on how to define teaching very precisely, but generally it's accepted that it means helping other people learn. And there are many ways to do this. I think some of the key ingredients of teaching are firstly that you recognize a knowledge gap between yourself and the other person. So you somehow see that this other person is missing some knowledge or some skill or some information that you have and they don't have. Secondly, you will make some action to start to close this gap. So you will start to teach in however you are teaching. So this could be any kind of behavior, like giving them something, allowing them to watch you doing something, giving explanation, demonstration, any number of actions. Thirdly, you're monitoring the learner's progress. So you want to see if they actually improve based on the action you've given them. And then you'll adapt your teaching to what they need. If the teaching demonstration you gave is not effective, you'll try something else. And then if you see them improving their knowledge, then you will go to the next step. And this is how you keep progressing until you finally recognize that the learner has achieved a goal, which is whichever knowledge or skill that they should have. In terms of learning, we know from cognitive science that there are actually 2 stages of learning. There's the fast stage and the slow stage. The fast stage is the very beginning of a skill, that when you first come into contact with a skill and you have your first try, and this happens very fast in the brain, you start to experiment, you practice, you get a very fast learning curve. But then to further develop that skill, this is a very slow and long stage, and this can take a long time. And these 2 stages have completely different signatures in the brain. But how is this learning happening? We talk about individual learning and social learning. So individual learning is your own trial and error. It's what you do yourself when you're practicing something. And social learning is anything that involves another person. You might watch somebody, you might watch an expert doing something or ask them something. And so these two aspects are quite important. There are different terms that have been used by different disciplines to talk about the two elements of a skill. So, for example, archaeology talks about method and technique. Psychology talks about knowledge and know-how, or declarative and procedural learning. And these are all different words to talk about the same thing. This is, on the one side, the conceptual understanding of a skill. That means that's how you understand what it is. You can explain it, you know it. And on the other hand is the motor execution of the skill, and that's actually how you perform it, how well you can actually do it. And those are two completely different things. For example, this woodworking picture here, the woodworker knows he or she can explain what should be done, but in fact, maybe doing it takes a very precise hand, or you have to have a very steady hand, for example, or you might have to really be able to look very closely where to cut. And so we should keep in mind these two aspects of learning all the time. So when we think about the different ways of learning that we find in people, there's a real spectrum, a real wide range of different activities and behaviors. So for example, you might join in side by side in adults' activities, or you might be in a classroom and someone talks to you. You might also play with your friends. Children play with their friends and they teach each other things. And there's really a lot of different ways that people learn, and it really depends on what society they live in. For example, there are some societies where it's forbidden to tell other people what to do. So there, learning really happens through observation. And there's really very much cross-cultural variation. This is what I've just mentioned, especially in the amount of observation that people do. So in this experiment, they studied children from the US and children from Mexico, and they found that the US children were not watching what was happening. They were just looking at their smartphones. And in the Mexico, the children were very much paying attention to everything around them, and they were able to just learn the skill without any trouble. By the way, I don't see the chat, so if somebody could keep track of it for me, that would be very nice. Thank you very much.
Sorry, just to interrupt.
Yes.
Basically, what we were planning to do was just let you present and then afterwards address questions, unless you would like to be interrupted.
Okay. I think that do as you normally do.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So the questions that I've been thinking about in my research, firstly about these prehistoric skills of stone tool making, and how were they passed on? In particular, what were the teaching and learning strategies that people used in the past? And to answer this, it's been useful to think about how unschooled people learn. And you might have heard about this term, unschooling. It basically means people who do not go to school. And this could be people who live in the jungle in Congo who don't have access to school, or it could be also people in our society who choose not to go to school. And this is, there are some movements, some trend in some places, especially in the US, and also some in Germany where I live. Maybe you know some as well. And these are people who, for example, the parents of these children decide that they don't want to send them to school, so they teach them at home, or they don't teach them at all. And so there are different ways that somebody can be unschooled. And what the interest here is to understand how learning happens when it's not imposed from a formal school system. So I'll come back to this at the end. So in terms of the stone tool skills that I'm trying to understand, I give you here a demonstration of how prehistoric people actually had to make their tools. They had to start with rocks, shapeless rocks, and make them into something useful. So this is a flint here. You can see that the flint is black and the outside is white. It's you have to open really into the black. It's very sharp. You can make it into sharp edge. Okay, and I'll fast forward you to the end where you can see now the final tool is being created. So these are some of the skills that.
Sorry, Natalie, just maybe may I just ask Vivek, please mute your mic, and we'll ask all the participants to please mute their mics. Thank you. Sorry about that.
No problem. So the skills that were being done in the past were very much about hand skills, and you have to really aim well when you strike. I'll just keep playing this while I talk. You have to know, you have to have a visuospatial imagination. You have to aim with the right force. You have to have good eyesight so you see where you aim. And you have to also have a strategy. You have to have a conceptual knowledge of what order to hit these things in. And people who work on the technology in human past talk about different milestones. So the first one would be around 3 million years ago. And it's been called a momentous threshold in our evolution because it was essentially different from what other creatures were doing at the time. And there's another milestone here when people were using those stones to get a lot of meat. So they were eating carcasses, and the stone allowed them to really get into those carcasses to get much more meat to feed their brains and their bodies. And this also allowed their brains to grow very large. And that's why we have large brains, even though now we don't need to eat meat necessarily, but at one point in the past, that was what allowed the brains to get large. Now it's actually already in our human species. So we just need to feed ourselves food and to keep our brains running. And the third milestone was around 2 million years, 1.8 million years ago with the Unschooling. And there you start to see that people are turning these stones into a shape, and a very beautiful looking shape. And this is when probably people started really to have apprentices. And in particular, after that, we see these virtuosos. They are these very rare stone tools that appear extremely symmetrical, extremely beautiful, and you can see that they spent a lot of time to make every little cut, and they really took care to how these shapes look. And you don't need, it doesn't need to look beautiful to work well. You can actually cut a whole animal carcass with one of those simple tools. So in fact, these are something really aesthetic, something that were designed to be really looking beautiful. And this took a lot of skill and a lot of knowledge. So this experiment that I will present now was about how these skills were passed on. In particular, I asked how much teaching was needed to learn these earliest tool-making skills. And I collaborated with an evolutionary biologist, and we made this experiment in 5 conditions. So people either they could see only the tools, or they could watch somebody doing it, or they could interact, and the teacher could really only make very basic things like pointing or slowing down their movements. In the complex gesture condition, people were allowed to use their hands to make signs or indicate things, for example. And in the verbal language condition, they could talk and interact normally. So we used a chain design where somebody was taught, and then they had to teach the next person, and they had to teach the next person, and so on. And we looked at how well they were able to make these tools. And we tested 184 students. So here's the setup. In the beginning, there was an expert who started the chain. They choose one of those 5 conditions, and they taught somebody, and then they were tested. So the person had 5 minutes. They had to make as many good tools as possible from this chunk of rock. And then they became the teacher for the next student. So here's an example. This is the alone condition. So they really had no information. They could only see the tools, and they just don't know what to do. Here's the second condition where they could look at each other, but they couldn't interact. And the third condition, here are some very basic teaching. So the teacher on the left is really orienting her body towards the learner to give a better view. And here with a gestural teaching, so the teacher on the left still is showing some actions, and they can also interact by looking. And here's the final condition. And they spent a lot of time talking. So the results, we're looking here at the amount of good tools that were made from this rock, because when you are good at making stone tools, you can take a rock and make a lot of useful tools from it. And so you can see here that red, orange, and yellow are the 3 groups that were able to teach in some way, simple or teaching or explanation teaching. And they made a lot more, their students made a lot more good tools than the ones who didn't get any teaching. And here also you can see that in the full language, the red condition, they made a lot more also success. So the takeaway here is that teaching really helps in even the simplest technology that has been known since the dawn of humankind. So teaching really greatly enhances the earliest human technology. The second experiment here that I'll present is this origami study. So I wanted to know if the people learning were actually participators or observers. So if you're a participator, you're more likely to be side by side with the teacher, or perhaps together with them. And if you're an observer, you're more likely to sit facing them. And I wondered if this had any effect on the ability to learn a skill, because the viewpoint that you have depends on where you are positioned with respect to the demonstrator. If you're side by side, you have the same viewpoint. This is the egocentric viewpoint, and it's much easier on the brain. Whereas when you're facing somebody, it's allocentric viewpoint. So you have to actually, you see what they do. Your brain has to transform this in 3 dimensions and turn it around to your own position. And this is, we know that it's a lot more demanding. So here's an example of learning side by side. These are people in Papua New Guinea who are making stone tools, and they sit in this line together. And in the observer, that's a reconstruction of a 3 million year old ancestors, possibly learning by facing, by facing each other. So I here joined with a colleague who's an experimental psychologist. The reason her picture looks so funny is because she's caving, and this is how I know her, because we both are interested in exploring caves, and we also were both working together in the same university. So that was very nice, and we asked, how does this viewpoint affect the ability to learn a manual skill? So we chose origami, Japanese origami, because it's something simple yet difficult. Previous research showed that the egocentric viewpoint, that's the same viewpoint, is makes it easier to learn body movements and things like tying knots. For example, if you ever took a dance class, you might have found it easier when the teacher was showing their back to you, so that you could really imitate their movements. But other studies didn't find an effect on knot tying. So this seems to be conflicting. So we decided to test this with origami. And this is the fish experiment, the fish origami figure. And here we created videos in these 4 views. So we looked at the egocentric and the allocentric viewpoint, and also the hand preference, if the person is right-handed or left-handed. So this means we had 4 different views on our videos, and we actually just took one video and then we flipped it around 3 ways to get the 4 conditions. So the participants watched these videos and they had to learn to make those origami figures. We had 32 students and 8 different origami figures. And then they were watched in one of those 4 conditions. And we looked at how well they performed, and to know how well you make origami, we looked at whether the asymmetry was the same as the demonstrator or different, looked at how similar the final figure looks to the original, the time to complete it, and the number of times they were pausing or rewinding the video, because they could interact with the video as much as they want. And we predicted that learning should be worse with the allocentric view. So the allocentric view is here at the top. That's like you're facing the teacher, and the egocentric is at the bottom. And then you have the right and left. And here's a video showing all the 4 conditions at once. So this is how to make a dolphin. So now you know how to make a dolphin with origami. So the result of that experiment was we didn't find any effect of viewing position. So in fact, people were able to copy and learn those figures in all the 4 conditions. We think that perhaps we didn't have enough people in our study. We only had 32. Maybe if we had more, we would find some stronger results. And also we think that the actual origami perhaps is quite easy to learn. So I think if we had something harder like stone tool making, that we would find an effect. So I'd like to talk now about unschooling. So this picture here is a Neanderthal child. It's a reconstruction, and I like this very much because it shows us how different people can be. And this Neanderthal child lived around, I think, 50,000 years ago. It was not related to us, so it was a parallel branch of humans that went extinct. And in fact, their brains were larger than our brains, and they were making extremely complex tools, stone tools, that even now we struggle to reconstruct. So they were very smart, and yet they lived, you know, very primitive. They were hunting mammoths and really large animals. They were extremely talented, very strong, physically strong. And they didn't have school, of course, but they somehow were able to pass on all these skills that they needed to survive. So one of the ways to reconstruct a prehistory of teaching is really to look at how people in different societies can learn and teach. So there's a hypothesis out there that says teaching really is beneficial when it comes to difficult skills. So simple skills like scratching your nose don't need to be taught because children can just observe and they can imitate. But perhaps really when the skills they have something that can't be observed, or some secret information that needs to be explained, that's when teaching really helps. And we have some evidence from archaeology that some of those really beautiful tools I showed you, they're too hard to learn just by individual trial and error. You really need to be told the sequence, you need to be given tips by somebody who knows more. And really, like, you know, I've been making stone tools for like more than 10 years now, and I still cannot make one as beautiful as those. So people really were very expert in the past. And through these experiments that I did with my colleagues, we showed that demonstration really helps. So if you don't get any input from anybody, then you really struggle. But as soon as there's someone there who can demonstrate, then that really helps. And if they also teach at the same time, that's even better. So here, this picture is some Samoan islanders making baskets, and they use these palm trees to make baskets. I've seen this also in New Caledonia, where I did some field work. And they are very, they look simple, but in fact, they really take a lot of steps, and it takes a long time to learn how to make these baskets. I've seen children baskets, they're very clumsy, but the expert women who make them, they just look very beautiful, and they have a lot of skill. So how do unschooled people learn? This is the question, and this can give us some clues to how people in the past also learned. So I want to highlight here, classroom education is a really very recent invention. And in fact, it is not very effective. As you might have experienced yourself, if you remember your school when you were a child, you might remember it like this. And there might have been times when you really were very bored. And in fact, research shows that this kind of teaching is not the best at all. In fact, it is the least effective way of passing on information. So why do we do it? Why do schools continue? Well, this is because the education model has been taken up by most countries in the world, and it's really hard to change that model once it's established. But there are some schools that are already trying to get out of this, and they use a more a natural way of learning, which I'll talk about now. Well, we know that in different forms of teaching, the language involvement varies greatly. So there might be some, I mentioned societies where it's not allowed to tell other people what to do. So they don't explain, but they demonstrate. And here was a study also in Mexico where they taught children how to make origami. And they saw that the children were not talking about the origami, but they were using a lot of nonverbal conversation. So they would, for example, one child, she was not sure if she did it right. So she showed to her sister, and her eyebrows went up like a question. And then the sister pointed at something and corrected her mistake. So there's a lot of a conversation that can happen without actually talking. And as I mentioned before, also children are also very highly observant in many societies where learning happens by observation. So we are used to being taught by a teacher in a classroom. So we usually don't pay attention unless somebody's talking to us. And in a lot of societies where there's no classroom teaching, well, the children really, they look at everything around them. They're very curious. And also, if you live in a society where you have to learn everything by observation, then you had better be observant. So Professor Strauss mentioned this weird concept. So do you remember what he said? Let's take, let's fill in the squares. So what was W? Do you remember?
Western.
Western, yeah, very good. And how about the next one?
Educated.
Educated, yes. I?
Industrialized.
Industrialized, good. R?
Does anyone
Rich.
else remember? Rich?
Rich.
Rich, very good. And D?
Democratic.
Democratic, very good. Yeah. So what does this mean? It means that most of the research on teaching and learning has been done on people from societies that are weird. And it's weird because of all these things, but also because it's very rare. In fact, North America is usually where people do this research, in Europe. And that's a very small percentage of all the different types of cultures that are around the world. And being Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic is extremely rare. It's really not what characterizes us as humans. So in fact, when I went to the literature and I read a lot about what other types of non-weird people do. That's a typo, so the slide should say non-weird. So it's about people who are not in those weird societies. And what characterizes their learning? Well, they're very curious. They're always going around looking at things. They're self-motivated. The children don't need to be told what to make something, but they're always playing, always experimenting, and always keen to learn. They have a real drive to learn new things. A lot of those societies have a belief about autonomy, that you shouldn't tell children what to do because they are their own person, and each person has the right to choose what they do in their daily life. And that's why some places don't allow even telling what to do. Even something like telling a child, don't put your hand in the fire, that would be forbidden in certain societies. And in fact, the children really, there's no problem. They can see that it's hot. Sometimes they might put their hand near, but they learn it anyway. Also, then they're very keen observers. They know how to watch carefully and look at the details. They've also got the freedom to play all day long. And this is one thing that our Western school system has removed from us. And in this freedom to play, children have the possibility to really get their self-motivation and to watch all the people around them. And they're surrounded by people who tolerate their existence, who tolerate their questions or their observation. And finally, people of all ages are mixing together. So there's no classes of children at each age, but the whole society is mixed. So what I think in conclusion now, perhaps these are my ideas about how we can improve learning in all people, because we're all humans. And so we can take those principles, and I would say then to let people learn of their own interests. Don't try to force them to learn something they're not interested in. Also respect their skills and knowledge, because everybody has skills and knowledge. Even the youngest child, they also have things that they know how to do, and they're also very proud of that, and proud if they can pass it on. Be a perfect role model, another typo. So be a perfect role model. So you should, if you want someone to learn something from you, well, then you can demonstrate it and you show how it should be done. Also allow free time for people to experiment. Don't try to structure every moment of their day, but this free time to experiment is very important for people to really get their own learning consolidated. Be patient and available. Be tolerant to them if they have questions or they want to see something. Be there for them. And finally, encourage people to help others learn, because we know that when you help people learn, it improves your own learning. And children, in fact, are very keen to teach their siblings and their friends. And this will also improve their learning. So those are my advice for learning and teaching. And I'd just like to close by saying thank you very much to Professor Strauss and to Kripa for helping organize the talk. And So looking forward to your questions. Maybe I can stop the screen share.
Thank you so much. We did have a couple of questions in the chat.
Oh, and if you, Kripa, could just keep an eye on the time, I would be grateful. I don't have a clock.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So the first one from the chat is speaking about your article.
Kripa, I think that's Gayatri's question. She
Is
could
it?
probably summarize and then just say it, I think, because she's been putting them
Go
up.
for it, Gayatri.
Thank you for the wonderful talk and the wonderful article. I mean, it was just such a pleasure. It was just, I learned so much how you systematically approach the whole, and I don't know, it was very, very beautifully written, and I learned a lot from it. So thank you so much. I have several questions actually based on that, but I'll ask one question. So the thing is that the experiment was mainly done with the Liverpool students. I know you already mentioned it's a small number, but you know, the three things that you mentioned, which is critical to origami folding, is, I mean, ability to internalize what the folding needs to be done, and the ability to do the mental rotations when, you know, depending on the kind of view they are able to do, and also to be able to do the folding, that is using your own motor skills and motor representations of how it is done. So given that they are undergrad students or Liverpool students, I mean, they are pretty good cognitively, and I mean, they probably definitely fall in the weird category. You know, so if you were to do maybe with like, you know, younger school children, or, you know, like who haven't developed all these abilities that much, or maybe with, as you said, non-school people, like would you have seen differences in differences in the way would you have gotten more support towards your basic hypothesis on the handedness? And there was another question I had, is, since you had also mentioned that, you know, people tend to learn by imitation. Since the number of left-handed people are so small, like 10% or things like that, why wouldn't evolution eventually eliminate all left-handed people? Because, you know, eventually if you just learn from right-handed people and imitate, eventually there should be no left-handed people. Why is it not the case?
Thank you very much. I'll answer your first question first about the origami experiment. So it's a very interesting idea to test younger children or students who are perhaps less achieving. So I think that's a great experiment that should be done for sure. I would expect to find that I would expect, if it's somebody from Liverpool, from the same society, I wouldn't expect a difference, because in fact they're already used to watching videos. So this idea to learn from a video is not new for them. And also the motor skills really are not very difficult. So most people have folded a paper once in their life. Very young children, perhaps you would really see a difference. So I think there's probably an age at which you could find a big difference. So it would be really fun to try this experiment with children of different ages and find out really at what point you start to see an effect. Your second question about left-handers, it's very good also, thank you. Why didn't the left-handers all disappear already? So this is the question actually. So there are different theories. One of them, or the main theory actually, is that there's something else keeping the left-handers. It's some benefit to be left-handed. And some ideas about what is this could be the benefit. Well, we know that left-handers are more successful in certain sports like tennis, ping pong, fencing. So there are some sports really where, some really competitive sports where being a left-hander is an advantage because you have a surprise advantage. Most people are not used to playing against a left-hander, so you can really win. And we see that statistically that left-handed athletes are more successful. And there are also some suggestion that some left-handers have also been very brilliant geniuses throughout history. So it's possible that there is something associated with left-handedness that gives you a cognitive advantage somehow. But this advantage only works if you are the minority. So this with sports, for example, it's only an advantage when left-handers are 10% of the population. So this is why there should be a stable number of left-handers. It doesn't go up or down.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sophia had asked a question that, Sophia, I'm not sure if your question was answered in Gayatri Shetty's question. Could you?
Yeah, what I wanted to ask, I mean, is like Natalie said, everybody knows how to fold up paper usually when they're adults. So they look at the video and say, okay, the paper has to be folded, for example, diagonally. And they look at the finished product, like the diagonal shape of the paper, and they know already what movements are needed for that. So they don't depend on watching the movements. They look more at what the end product will look like. So maybe in stone knapping, that's different because we don't know how to do stone knapping, so we depend more on watching the gestures. But in our society, like paper folding is not such a difficult skill. So we already are, maybe that's why there's no difference in the egocentric and allocentric view. That was my idea. So I was wondering if that could be the case.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. I think that's probably a most likely explanation. So this paper folding is already familiar to students in Liverpool. So yes, stone knapping is much more opaque, or much harder to really interpret. So in fact, I did some follow-up experiments with stone tool making, and we found that it really it's changing the brain. So the training really does change something in the brain structure. So there really is learning going on. So there's something has to be learned for sure. Thanks.
Yes, thank you.
And then Debashish had one question, and then we'll get to Anushree. Debashish, do you want to just ask?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you, Natalie, first of all, for the wonderful article and the great presentation. I'm sure everybody here is feeling blessed to be part of this. I had a couple of questions. Based on the reading of the article and the presentation, this is societies where the student has been given a frame or a podium or somewhere where he feels important, where he can directly answer a question, and or for example he's called forward to demonstrate while he is learning, or where the teacher is someone whom he can directly connect with, whether emotionally, socially, or through some, the learning is faster because the student is able to catch that attention with the teacher. So based on this, your observation from the paper of being on the egocentric side or allocentric side, can we like conclude or frame a larger conclusion from the presentation and the article that situations where the student is going to feel important, or where the students' desires, emotional or others, are fulfilled to a greater extent, there the learning is faster?
Yes, thanks. I mean, this is a great point, and especially, I mean, you have all thought a lot more about how to really practice your teaching and how to make effective teaching. I've only, well, I have experience as a school teacher myself, but only for 2 years, so not so long. But I could really see the difference between how teaching affects learning, and for sure, it's really important that students have to really feel engaged and feel involved. And so I think the viewpoint would really make an effect. So for example, a simple change that I used to make in my classroom, instead of having me standing there facing the students, I just make a circle that everyone sits in a circle. So everyone is facing together, and then everyone feels like being side by side. And this also really increases the communication, and especially for the shy students who are afraid to talk, this also helps them feel less shy and also get more engaged. So for sure, this is certainly something important to think about. Yeah, so there are changes, as you say, there are many changes that can be made in the classroom. You don't have to just say, oh, we stop classroom. No, but you can make many changes in the classroom to increase the effectiveness of teaching.
And Natalie, one more point I wanted to make. The conclusions from the paper, where being on the same side as the teacher enhances or helps in learning. Would that be equally valid if we had people from mixed cultures, where people are not familiar for getting closer? Or would it be equally valid also where the teacher is not comfortable with the student being on the same side? What I'm trying to hint at, Natalie, is probably there is a deeper conclusion behind this rather than the allocentric and egocentric viewpoint. There is rather a deeper connection that is being made. Is my observation valid?
I think so. I mean, I guess there are cultures where it's not allowed to approach the teacher so well, or where a student could not look over the teacher's shoulders, certainly. And I think this makes a distance, right? So I think, but in those cultures, the children are used to this. So they already, I think, are more used to doing this mental rotation. So perhaps if you grow up doing it, you probably already are experienced. So it's not so much of a challenge, I would predict. But I think this research should be done.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Thank you so much.
I wanna jump to Anushri, who's had her hand raised for a little while. Anushri, do you want to go ahead, and then we'll go back to the chat questions?
Okay, thank you so much, Kripa, and thank you, Natalie, for your article and your presentation, and just this whole wonderful new this research area. It's quite interesting. I was just thinking while you were presenting that it seems to me that it's just recently in human civilization that we started going off and doing our own things. But for most of human history, we lived in homogeneous small circles. So if you were from a fishing family, you grew up to be a fisher, you married a fisherwoman, and it was generations of fisher folk that was part of your whole upbringing. So while you may have learned by observation and imitation, it was over your entire life, not just sort of a experimental kind of thing. And even now in traditional families where the roles are defined. If you're a girl, you're the one doing the cooking, and the boy is off doing whatever he wants. So you've been in the kitchen with your mother your whole life. So she never really had to teach you how to cook. You've just been there with her, helping with tasks along the way. As you grew older, you got to do more important things. You got to deal with the knife, with the fire, whatever, whereas you were young. So anyway, the whole question is that this learning by observation and imitation seems to me is a thing that happens over a lifetime and not so much in a small experiment. So I wanted to ask what you thought about that.
Yes, well, thank you very much. So, I mean, that's a great point, and it's true indeed that learning is a lifetime thing, and we really never stop learning until we leave this world. So, really, the idea, I guess, this is one argument against formal schooling, because it takes children out of context and gives them small bites of education that are not included in the daily life. And so, of course, when the baby is involved in the kitchen from birth, they are really learning from observation. And this is one thing that the study with the Mexican children, they actually also observed babies in Mexico. So the babies are in like a sling. The mother wears them on the back or on the front, and the babies are they're really like looking everywhere. And this is a real difference to the US babies, which are seem to be quite passive. So there seems to be really something there. It's probably most likely cultural, but in any case, those Mexican babies are very already observing things from the earliest age. And so this is their natural curiosity that probably all children have. The problem is in our Western society, that natural curiosity is just destroyed by school. And so if you know any like 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds, they're probably also very, very observant, very interested in helping with chores or things like that. And so this is a really important point. Thanks.
Thank you also. Yes, because I think about examples in those same traditional societies, you see the little baby out in a boat, or in an agricultural society or cattling or whatever, where they have horses. You see a little kid riding a horse. So you're right, there's something about the curiosity in kids when they grow up watching these things. They're curious and they learn, and then it's definitely different than school learning. So thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Vishnu, do you want, can you address your question?
Yeah, hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hey, we can hear you.
Yeah, so I'm Vishnu. Yeah, so thank you for your wonderful talk. And the article was just amazing. And like, it has been something that I have also thought about these things. So I just wanted to ask do you think the way that a learner takes in information and tries to learn, even those kind of things affects this thing? Like so some people, so we can broadly categorize the learners as audio learner, visual learner, like kinesthetic learner, right? So do you think that has in any ways an influence over their learning and these things? Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for bringing this up. I didn't mention that in my talk, but I've been thinking about this a lot, especially probably like you through the classroom experience as a teacher. And this is super important also. So people really, there's so many different types of learners. It seems to be naturally just how we're born. And in fact, most people are not verbal visual learners. Our school system is based on this verbal visual teaching style, but in fact most people don't learn that way. They learn through manipulating objects and other kind of sensory input. So absolutely, this is something that really needs to be carefully considered in teaching, because in fact, we as teachers, we tend to teach in the learning style that we have. So it's really like, I'm a very linguistic verbal person, and so for me it's very difficult to imagine how a kinematic learner could learn things. And so we have to really push ourselves to design our lessons in a way that will be accessible to those different learning styles. And I think it's very good to do that, and also to ask the learners themselves, because often they have some idea of some way to implement a lesson in their way. So it's also, what's also important though is not to really stay focused on one of those learning styles, like really use all of them, because just because somebody is good at one, they should really push themselves in the other areas. So we try to really be well-rounded. Of course, people have tendencies, so of course, yeah, and there should, like in another experiment, then I would test for learning styles to see if that has any effect on the result of the study.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Bhavani Chechi, do you want to?
Mine are not questions, but more comments. One thing I was thinking is that in the non-weird societies, it's not so much that they're completely free to learn and explore however they feel like. They do have areas where they actually they learn. It's usually around the trades. Typically, girl children are more involved in the caring and the nurturing, so they tend to imitate their mothers and in taking care of their siblings or doing work that their mothers do, while the boys tend to get more involved in what the fathers do or the larger thing. And so, but they seem to have larger chunks of free time where they're not actually doing something. So so there is some amount of it's not like that they're completely free to explore exactly what they feel like doing or what they want to learn. A lot of the skills are dependent on how they have to survive. And I think that is the main difference between the weird societies and the non-weird societies. The second thing about the word weird, I don't know if you're involved in policy making, Natalie, but if you're involved in policy making or you influence policy making with the talks, no, okay. I think the word weird should be changed, because the reason is you say it's Western, it's industrialized, it's rich, it's educated, and it is democratic. These are all positive qualities. So even though the words comes out as weird, you may have a smile about it, but you're already talking about things that every single country and everybody wants to achieve. So when you're calling an educational system weird, you're actually qualifying it with all the positive aspects that the entire world wants to. But so if you want to change that, maybe the acronym should be really based on what are the negative aspects of that teaching, if you want to change it. And it should be more, and I've heard this word weird, mostly I think maybe thanks to Sid, mostly in the context of education, and not in other areas. But maybe maybe if you were using it in education, it should be more addressed to the Western style of education, which is the classroom, which is based education. And if we hope to that this research eventually leads to policy, then there should be something a little bit more indicative. Otherwise, it's you'd want to be weird. There's no reason for us not, for anybody in the world not to want to be weird.
Yes, this is, thank you. That's a very good point. I've never thought of this, but I completely agree with what you say. And in fact, there's also another acronym, LOL, and it's been used in linguistics, and it refers to languages that are large, official, and literate. And actually, in thinking about it, it's a similar problem. because in fact most languages would aspire to be those things. So really, you're right. I'll think about this. We should really brainstorm and find a new term that's focusing on the negative aspects. I think that would be more fair, in fact, because really the point of this is to highlight the benefits of those non-weird cultures, right? So we really want to show what they can offer us and what they have, what their strengths are. Your first question really about the hunter-gatherer societies, yes, so thank you for clarifying. The children are not, of course, completely free all day, but they do participate in chores. And I think those are really their main learning experience. So the mother will say, go and fetch some water, and the child has to actually really participate in those tasks. So they do have duties, but they don't have a timetable necessarily. They don't have to be in school from 8 till 12 or something like that. So yes, structuring the day through the survival tasks, I think, is anyway in every culture. And that's also where the children can get a lot of models to learn from.
Isaac, you had included something in the chat, so I wanted to invite you to speak.
Everyone. Well, this is Isaac. Mine was more of an observation actually than a question, because in that article that you sent, you said you concluded that that actually this learning that sorry hold on a bit. Well, you concluded that it's easier to learn easily from the same-handed people. So from what I've gone through, because personally I'm a left-handed person since childhood, I've seen that it's actually very easy for us left-handed people to learn from the right-handed people when they're opposite us, because coming from a baby's side, if you sit with a baby just opposite, and then you do an action with your right hand, then the baby thinks that actually it's the same hand as their left hand. Yeah. So it becomes very easy for someone to imitate the same hand in their line. Yeah, so that's what I saw, and it's how, which the article never talked about. Yeah, and I think that one grows also with us, because since we are dominated by left-handed people, and then it's very easy for us to learn from them. That's why I think you see very many people being competent in like experiments and arts. That's what I could say. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's a really great point also, and that's something that we should do in the next experiment, or that you should do in the next experiment for sure. So yeah, the interaction between viewpoint and hand preference is definitely something to look at. And yeah, as you say, this facing position, because it's mirrored, actually it could be easier. So there have been very few studies that looked at this. And in fact, the original paper from Michel and Harkins of 1984, where they had people learning to tie knots, I once met the author, and he told me that in fact what they also didn't report in their paper, but they had the learners would often move So they started out facing, and then they would move and change position to stand next to the demonstrator. So people really, if they're allowed to move around, they will position themselves in the way that best suits them. So according to the hand preference, they might prefer to be in one or the other position. So I think also giving people the freedom to move can also help. Thanks.
Yes, okay, thank you.
I know Sid had mentioned a few things in the chat. Did you want to speak, Sid?
Kripa, could you repeat that? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
No, I was just saying that I know you had mentioned a few things in the chat, and I was wondering if you would like to speak or have had any questions or comments.
Sure. I have so many things that I wanted to say. I'm tongue-tied. Why not sit? I'll just ask a few questions. Natalie, you don't have to answer. We can talk about it later if you want. Just things that, as you were speaking, popped up in my mind. So one of them is, so you're talking about language and teaching. It's a very deep question about the nature of the relations between them. You can teach without language. Language probably makes teaching more efficient. And there are also concepts that cannot be demonstrated. Right? You know, go and demonstrate the concept of justice or abstract concepts. So the language part is necessary. And I was just wondering, I know this is a terrible question to ask, and I've read a little bit about it, but when did language enter the human repertoire? And whenever it is hypothesized, I know there are all kinds of questions about musculature in the larynx and all sorts of physiological explanations and brain explanations, etc. And I was wondering if maybe language onset could be part of an explanation for how you move from one level to another in terms of tool use or tool making. So that's number one. I'm sure people have talked about it, and I'm not asking something that nobody's asked before, but I don't know much about it, and I would have been, or I am interested to know about that. So that's number one. Number two, so you talked about, and I think correctly, that teaching takes place when whatever it is that you're teaching is difficult and which cannot be picked up just by observation. That's in the case of making objects, for instance, or cooking or whatever, hunting. What you teach in schools in the West, in the weird countries, are basically cultural achievements that are hard earned. People have spent hundreds and thousands of years trying to understand something. And it's not intuitive. What it is that is taught in schools is not natural, and it's not intuitive. So it requires teaching. Otherwise, you're asking people to reinvent the history of cultural achievements and knowledge and etc. So, you know, we don't want to do that, and not many people can do that, and probably nobody can do that when there's so many different areas. Yeah. So schooling is necessary in the teaching cultural achievements, as I said, which are not intuitive. If intuitively, naturally, you come to learn something, then there's no point in teaching it because you're going to get it anyway. So it's, the time when it's necessary is when you're not going to get it, by being exposed to your everyday environment. And so we've created schools, carpentered environment, a special environment, an environment which is not like the natural environment, on the assumption that the natural environment is not enough to help children and adults come to understand unnatural or non-intuitive ideas. So there has to be some sort of a mix between free exploration, as you spoke about it, for sure, and the other parts, which is if you want people to, to know how to get along culturally and have the ideas of that are appropriate at that time, not 300 years ago, not in the medieval times. You teach those things. So those are two questions that I had. So let me say this. I sent you. I explained a little bit about AMMACHI Labs and the Center for Women's Empowerment and Gender Equality with some clips. And you wrote back and you said, this is amazing. Every place should be like this. Every university should look like this. So here is an invitation. When COVID is over and we can move around freely in the ways that we did before this, it would be wonderful if there was a possibility for you to come to the ashram and to meet people at AMMACHI Labs in the center, and then you have an opportunity to meet all these wonderful people who are here in India. And there were questions that people asked that you hadn't thought about, and probably not in the literature. People come here, people come from engineering, from computer science, a lot of techies, and they come with understandings that are not the same as when you give a talk to social science people, right? So I'd like to thank you for really a terrific presentation. There was a lot going on in the chats. People were asking all kinds of things, wanted to know things. So you engendered the curiosity and thought about the ideas that you presented. And what you presented is actually, I think, but I'm jaded, deep, and has to do with what is it that is common to all human beings: the ability to teach, ability to pass on knowledge, understandings, aesthetics, you name it. And it is what makes us human, which allows us to have a history as things get passed on. And it is, I think, one of the most profound kinds of human communications that exist. And you've showed us in your presentation how that is the case and why that is the case. So thank you very much for taking time out, for enlightening us. It was edifying. And as you see from the questions that were asked, it raised enormous interest. So again, thank you. And you and I will talk in the near future, of course. And hopefully, if there are people who are interested in following up, and if it's okay with you, they would, I'm sure people would be interested in asking you questions and possibly even doing collaborative work if that's something that would make sense for you and that would be helpful for you, and of course for the people who would be working with you. So again, thank you.
All right.
Terrific time.
Thank you very much.
Great job.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been a real honor to speak with you. And yes, your questions have made me think in new ways. So it's been really a great pleasure to speak. And of course, I would be delighted to visit in person if it ever becomes possible again. That would be a huge honor for me. I saw that there's a lot of chat, but I couldn't read it. So maybe, Kripa, would you be able to send me the chats later?
This is a very good question.
Or would it appear in the recording?
Oh, I don't know. Wait, maybe
Yeah. Yes, Kripa, it will come, all the chat will get stored along with the recording, so you can download it from the cloud.
Okay, great. Thank you. And yes, I would also, of course, be very happy for collaborations. And also, yeah, you feel free to email me to continue discussions.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Natalie. Thank you.
And yes, on behalf of everybody here at AMMACHI Labs and the Center for Women Empowerment, Gender Equality, really thank you so much. It was such a fun talk. And reading your paper was also really, it was super fun reading it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Maybe we can have like an acronym party sometime.
Yes, this would be great. Let's do it.
You didn't read my chat. I came up with one already, but it's a little inappropriate, so. Okay.
But we can start.
Yes.
Thank you very much once again for the invitation.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
So I can't download this chat. I've been trying to copy and paste it, but it's not working. I'll see if there's a way for me to download it from the website to send to you.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it will be, if it sounds like it's on the recording, and I will send you a link to the recording as soon as I have it sorted.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you.
So have a nice day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Have a nice day.
Bye, everyone.